Welcome in to the Energy Tech Podcast, where today we are recording part 8 of our Control Room Management Miniseries, as Mike and Daniel will be discussing internal communication plans and manual operations. Guys, welcome to Cannonsburg.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for that intro. I am your co-host, Mike Flores, with the Energy Tech Podcast, right here in Cannonsburg, PA, in the heart of the OpSite Energy Control Center, again with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Daniel Netto, our VP of Regulatory and Compliance right here at OpSite. Daniel, this is going to be a good show, man.
Yeah, thanks for guys having me on.
Yeah, this is going to be good, and we really want to talk about this episode. It does impact every control room at some point, and it's going to happen to you even when you least expect it, I think, because disasters or times when you lose communication or when you have to go to a manual operation, it's not a respecter of holidays, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the main thing of this episode is what happens when SCADA fails, right?
Yeah. So Daniel, give us an episode overview. Where are you going to take us with this one?
Well, we're going to cover the requirements of this section, Section C3, and then we're going to go over real-world experiences that we've seen for manual operations and roles that are part of the manual operations, and cover as far as the plan and what's expected, and as far as adequacy and part of your plan and testing. So,
and then your implementation. We'll cover some implementation Q&A that will probably help to clear a little bit of doubt. So you'll take us there, cover those sections, touch some real world stuff, which I think is good. And then, what the plan has to cover to give you some real compliance, what you're going to need, some adequacy, like you said. So I think one of the things about this show, we want to make sure if you're watching, you're listening, don't forget, like and subscribe. Invite anyone else in the community, especially if they're operators, if they're managers, someone that's in compliance, you've inherited a control room sometimes, or you really are looking for a way to help with your gap analysis, things like that. You can like and subscribe and put scenarios in there. No one's saying you got to name names, but what you can do is outline a scenario, and we'd be happy to address and talk about it right here on the episode. I think that would be great. So great. Now we know what we're going to cover. And again, those SCADA outages, they are inevitable. And sometimes those SCADA outages aren't just everything goes black. Sometimes it's, you're operating something and that goes out. You lose communication right in your control room. You may have a backup, but you do have to move to a plan. Some things go dark. There's some pipeline safety issues. It's going to happen to you, and we're going to cover that. So, Daniel, give us the context here. What's the important part of this that's being covered, and why PHMSA cares?
Well, just because the SCADA system goes down, again, it's ultimately what you're doing as far as what you have in place as far as a plan regarding if and when that happens.
Right.
And just like you spoke, it could be a full SCADA system outage. It could be segments. It could be, just a facility that goes down, or just a delivery point, or some controlled point that's been identified is critical for your pipeline.
Right. So let's talk about real quick why PHMSA even cares about this, because we know SCADA is not guaranteed. So if you kind of look, we cover those where the operator has to demonstrate the capability, to, of course, safely operate the pipeline. And then you typically want to have a way to do this manually when technology fails. So if in my understanding, there's typically the plan adequacy. The plan needs to outline that. You've got to have your annual testing that needs to happen, not to exceed, I think it was 15 months. Your testing record, how you're going to do this in terms of capability, and then any field coordination has to be documented as part of your overall plan. Is that right?
Yeah, so you want to make sure, and this is for, gas and liquids, right? So you want to make sure that you have a communication plan in place, an internal communications plan. Again, this is for manual operations, right?
Yeah.
If SCADA goes out, you want to make sure that you have something in place, so that way you can continue to monitor the pipeline, right, safely, right? And that's what this episode's about, making sure that we're covering some of the things that are required, from the protocol. And as you're going into any type of audits, is something that you definitely want to check on within your own plan to make sure that you have covered.
Yeah. And so you've got the plan, you've got an annual test, have your testing records, have that manual capability spelled out, and then have your field coordination spelled out, right? Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. So definitely, you definitely want to have that plan in place, trained on it, make sure that everyone understands their roles within what it could be a full SCADA outage.
Yes.
Right. So now we've been leading up to how much, how important it is to provide the controller all this information on the SCADA screen.
Right.
And now it's gone. Right. So now we're at the point where he's running blind, and how is he going to operate, this pipeline, in this scenario where there's been an outage.
Right.
So this is why you need to have that in place, and you need to make sure that everyone understands their roles. And I'm not speaking from the roles of, what the controller's role is. It's about who he's making contact with and making sure that they understand their roles at the field level, because now they're an extension of the control room to ensure whether or not it's just shutting down the pipeline or continuing to, run the pipeline with the information being called in.
Right.
So the controller needs to know who they're calling from, their SCADA group, field personnel,
Sure.
and ultimately from management to communicate what's going on.
Yeah. So let's there's the slide after this one, which says what the plan must cover. But before we go through these major pillars of what the plan must cover, I have a question.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're in the control room, you lose field communication. We can't see the pipeline, we can't see things. What's the timing around that? Because should that be also documented about the amount of time to allow something to reconnect? Like, what is that anywhere, either in a Q&A, a federal rule? Because sometimes I've been in plenty of control rooms, things go dark, and it's like, oh man, call IT. It's like, instead of the internal communications plan, it's, oh man, someone check with IT. Why did we lose communication? Let's check with OT. So is there timing around that?
Yeah. So again, basically you want to, one, identify the time that works for your operations, right? So with every plan, there's something that could be different as far as that time frame. However, it is required for you to have something in place, right? So therefore, you lose communications to a device. How long are we waiting? Exactly what you're talking about, right? So that needs to be documented. And then what also has to be looked at is, when do we say that we need to now move to a manual state, right? Where people are now calling in that information.
So when do you implement that plan at this time?
Yeah. Right. So that's up to you to identify and document. And when you're running these, these tests, you want to make sure that you look at that information and say, okay, we actually hit this, right? Because now you're deploying people at the field level, right? Can they actually get there within the time frame that you're stating? Yeah. Because say you're waiting, 5 minutes, right? So it all depends on the operations and what individuals are doing for their systems in general. But again, it speaks to the internal communications plan, making sure, again, like you said, it's not just on IT to check certain things. Right. It's making sure that we have something in place that states, yes, we're making that phone call, but we also know that there's a time frame on that response. Got it.
So let's talk about it then. What the plan must cover. You've got some pillars you've put out. Walk us through each one of these. Each pillar, what is it that the plan has to cover?
Right. So you want to make sure that, out of these pillars, you want to make sure that you're looking at who's talking to who, right? From the standpoint of, again, controllers to the, it's not just about having a contact list or making sure that we know who to call, because, you don't want to spend time constantly calling the same people, right? You want to be able to move through a scenario, and this is where it comes down to who you're contacting. You have your on-call people, you have your SCADA support team, you have your operations people. Those are the beginning of when you're, going to deploy your plan, right?
Right.
So there's that escalation, I guess. It's not just a call-out tree. It's more of how you're escalating through that and who's calling who.
Okay. So you've got who talks to whom. Then you have one of your pillars you're addressing is how they communicate.
Yes.
Right.
So, you got to think about communications now. In this event, did you lose, all communications? Is your phone system down? Do you have a backup phone system? And how's that working in this scenario? I mean, in the past, you talk to several people, they may have a satellite phone.
Right.
How often is that checked?
Right.
Do you have things in place if you're using that? Does everyone know that that's there? It's just the redundancy of it, and your plan should cover you losing these functions. So just in case, if you have a communication outage and you lose your phones, well, your plan should cover, hey, if we lose our phones, this is what we're doing.
Got it.
Again, this is not something that you're learning when it happens. These are processes that have been reviewed and made sure that it actually works for your operations.
Right. Okay. So you're documenting, number one, who talks to whom, and you're really advising them in steps. Step one, controller's going to contact field leads. They're going to use one of the methods of communication. They're going to contact the SCADA support team. That could be an integrator that's working in the system. It could be, or actually your in-house team. It could be, hey, this is the person assigned for on-call. Then you have your duty managers. Here's the series of people you'll contact for notification or to get additional support. And then who you're going to contact both in the rule of thumb for me has always been up and downstream. Who am I going to contact upstream of this on other control rooms and downstream any sort of dispatch or control rooms as well, right? So I think that is one. The other one you just talked about is how they communicate. Address, you will use, this primary phone, or here's a number of phone line that's available, or that's, a phone that we have in the control room. It's wireless. You will use the satellite phone, which is located in X, right? You'll have a redundant data leak, ensure that you're connected to here. And then you'll fall back. Here's my fallback procedure if those channels fail.
Yeah. So again, this is going to build up. So if you look at that last column, right, this kind of ties back to column 1 where it says here, you got to remember it could be a mass outage. So it could be several people that you're making contact with as far as operations. There could be different SCADA groups, if things like that, that are affecting different segments.
Yes.
And so this is where it goes back to identifying, who's talking to whom, right?
Yes.
So this as far as your controller on call could be for this area, based off of this segment that's been affected, right? And it moves on to valves and equipment status, and information being shared. So now you know who to call, and now the next thing is making sure that you have something in place to identify what they're actually reporting back to you.
Yeah.
It's critical. And this is kind of, again, this is where it leads up to where from the field to the control room, everything is labeled the same as far as this is a discharge, this is, suction, this is PIT, whatever that is. You want to make sure that you identify that again, and as far as your plan, so that way when you are making these phone calls and they are coming back in, from the equipment status, any type of lineups, everything is what you're talking about all the way through.
So an example is you lose field communicate. I mean, you moved to your internal communications plan. You documented who talks to whom. You've documented how they communicate. Now you're documenting in the scenario, we will send a pipeline tech to the pipeline. He will walk the pipeline and provide the affected segment, any readings, and he will do it hourly. And then we'll do a manual lineup because sometimes a valve or a bypass, something may fail close. And you're going to want to open a bypass. So you got to mention that in your plan that says you're going to have this affected segment. They will walk this pipeline. They will provide readings on the hour. You will have a manual lineup that may look like this. And then you're going to confirm those actions via a checklist. And then the update frequency, which I mentioned earlier, might be an hour. It could be, we want you to do this every 30 minutes. Whatever's written into your plan. Is that right?
Yeah. The thing is, it allows the operator to identify what works for their operations.
Yes.
And the biggest part of this, having a script, I don't mean that as, it's basically defining that
right
within your operations plan.
Sure.
Of who you're calling.
But you should have that same detail, though, right?
Exactly.
That's something you want to
have. This is exactly what you want shared. This is the information that you want from these areas, these facilities, these segments, what the equipment is, the valve lineups.
Yeah.
Because you got to remember, if they know what they're going out there to collect and know what they're looking at, it's going to be an easy kind of a transfer back into the control room. We'll lead into that a little more here.
Sure.
But again, the frequency and confirming, the actions of the information that's being, provided to the controller. So I don't mean a script as far as like, having something written. It's really identifying within your plan, what equipment, what they're looking at as far as lineup. Again, from manual operations, what does normal look like?
Yeah.
What does selling to this, this delivery point look like as far as a lineup? Do they need to change something? So, and being able to walk them through that and making sure that that's correct and accurate, that's important. So to make sure that you have that information lined out. There could be tanks there. What equipment needs to be called back in?
Right.
Because you're looking for consistency.
Yeah. And I'm saying it's a script. I'm saying more that you should have that documented at site. Hey, these sites, this is what you're looking for. This is what you can expect.
And that's the purpose of testing this, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone's on the same page. It's predefined. Everyone understands, you have a plan in place. And that's where it's important that people hit these and make sure to think about it from that level.
Yeah. So let's move on to the real world example. You've kind of outlined one for us where, you've got a SCADA outage, and this I think you're comparing here a vague plan versus what good documented looks like and tested, right?
Yeah. So again, here, this is a vague plan where, they had an outage and, they're kind of unclear what to do,
right?
And calling field personnel out, the coverage and what they're collecting. So, a lot of this information, you're calling, your field and they're trying to figure it out. Again, these are not things that you want to, test during an event. You want to make sure that it's already been vetted. You have this information in play. You're not saying someone out there and they're not sure what they're calling in, and your controller understands this information that's being reported back to them.
Got it. I do want to ask you, now that you do, let's suppose that you're in your 15-month window, not to exceed 12 to 15 months.
Not to exceed
right?
15. And
not to exceed 15.
Yeah.
But let's suppose that, oh man, we hadn't got around to testing and it happened. Can we count that as a test?
Yes. So and again, you got to make sure that you look at everything, right?
Yeah.
You need to make sure, check your documentation, what you captured. You can actually take an actual event and use that, and that's fine. You can do those things.
But do you have to document it and say, okay, as a result of this, we're going to tie back to, a management of change. We're going to, No. Okay. So you have the event, you run your test, you realize, hey, we did this. We need to improve X, X, and X. How do you document that anywhere?
Yes. So anytime that you run any type of test, you should be documenting whether or not you've reviewed what the outcome was at, right?
Got
so you'll do a lessons learned and any follow up. So, for example, your test is not due until December, okay?
Right.
But you had an actual outage in June, and you've identified, hey, you know what? This is we forgot to add a new facility that we brought online, right? We've identified that through this. This was a lesson learned. We forgot to update the documentation, so therefore it wasn't, no one was sent out there. Well, you can run it again, right? So now you have time to run an actual drill and make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Okay. So back to the real world example you've mentioned. Here's the directive. If it's vague, it's typically, we'll figure this out. It's very unclear, in terms of field coverage. Nothing. There's a bunch of unscripted requests. Just send whoever. Right.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen.
And they don't know what to call back as far as the equipment.
Right.
Right. They're not consistent.
Yes. Yeah. And then, there's kind of this, the post outage, the system, a lot of things, the state is unknown. Well, we don't know if that's, the value came back. We don't know. Right. So there's lots of vague, there's no real visibility there. And on the opposite side of that, when you are talking about a documented and tested one, you've got your actual immediate notifications with defined contacts. You've got scripted info. These are checklists. These are usually predefined. Yes, this is how you'll line up valves. This is how you'll determine that that you're flowing to a bypass, right? Those kinds of things. And then you'll have the real-time log of readings and actions and timestamps that you'll record. And then you're going to rapidly reconcile once the SCADA system comes back, right?
Yeah, and that's where we want to be at, right? So exactly that. So the immediate response is, you guys know who to contact at the field level. They know who to contact from a SCADA support group and operations, right? They know how to do that. And now they have the script of, again, what identified segments, making sure that it could be a different person for a different segment.
Yeah.
Right. And it could be different operations managers for different segments as well. So having that scripted out within your plan, drafted out in that procedure.
Yeah.
That's where, again, it's being logged and it's being reported back, for notation, and, you're able to capture that information a lot quicker because you're not out there, well, you're supposed to get this one. They know immediately when they respond.
Right.
Because it could change from locations as well.
Okay. So let me ask you this: in your past experience, what has been the inspector's focus? Obviously you've seen that before, right?
Oh, yeah. So the inspectors really focus on identifying everything we just spoke about. Like you can't just say equipment. You can't just say this valves or because there could be tanks there. So you really need to identify your critical locations, right? And you need to really identify what those equipments are. So really, you need to sit down, and if you're saying you're going to this one station, what does it look like from a normal state? What does it look like from an abnormal state? Or, it could be if you're changing the lineup.
Yeah.
What are some of those lineups that need to be identified, not only for the controller that's lost communications, to this facility, but also for the field operations to be able to quickly identify, all right, this is what what we need to change to, or what we need to, change the lineup to based off of.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've said that what they're looking for, let's walk us through the adequacy and the annual testing. What makes this adequate? You've already given us some good pillars and some kind of required records. So give us those. Walk us through each one of these. Just hey, this is the stuff that makes it adequate, and then here's the required record you're going to want to produce.
So you can do a tabletop, right?
Yeah.
You can, simulate from a SCADA outage, kind of walk through, whatever scenario that you may want to put on for this tabletop, and then look at the scripting for that. And so the important thing about that is to make sure that the participants are there. Make sure that you have everyone there, from the controller to field personnel, and even look at from SCADA support, and making sure that they understand their role as well, in this process of, tabletop. So you're looking at it from that perspective, make sure you have that in place to make sure that your manual procedures are, accurate. And then the communications portion of it, you want to make sure that everyone knows, what they're utilizing. Again, like I stated earlier, say your phones go down, right, as part of this event, right? Or were you going back to, cell phones? Say, cell phones are out too. I mean, you can identify backups and, how you're going to maneuver through that. And that should be listed out. And again, your plan should actually identify what you feel is going to stay, kind of in place, and it's not going to be jeopardized,
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What if a control room manager, supervisor, lead says, you know what, man, we really don't, we don't need to do the test because we have a backup control room. We'll go there. Like, we go there.
Well, that's really what this intent is, to test internal communications.
Right.
Right. So, as far as doing the tests, again, this is, you have to be able to, I guess the rule that's covering this is to say, can you operate your pipeline?
Yeah, safely operate. Yeah.
Safely operate this pipeline if you lost SCADA.
Yeah.
Because we know it's not guaranteed.
Right.
Right. So there could be some type of failure. There could be something that happens. So from the communication portion of it, or just, hey, we're going to go to our backup, that doesn't matter, because from the standpoint, we're looking at, can we operate this from a manual state at the field level?
Right.
So again, we definitely want to make sure that you have a plan in place. You're doing tabletop exercises. You're making sure that your communications is there, testing your response to these locations, and response of, just everyone in general. You want to make sure that you have a backup for a backup, right?
Yes.
So say you have an on-call person, do you have a second on-call? Do you have a second manager on-call for a certain area that may be affected? Is there a SCADA person that you may have an on-call for?
Right.
And, things like that in place. And then, again, making sure that you definitely document this in a way that, and review it. Again, this is where the lessons learned come into play, right? So what are the lessons learned? What are your follow-up actions? So, for example, you actually had an event, and this is where it's critical. Say you don't want to do a drill, right, because you had an actual event. Well, review that documentation, and does it hit everything here that's required, that you would say, okay, we're good with this actual event. We don't need to actually do a drill. But if you feel like we're going to do one anyways, and in the past, I've had, operators that, hey, we'll test one side, and then we'll test, another segment or another area, just to make sure that, they could be doing, 3 tests a year.
Yeah.
Depending on the segments that they have, or operations that, just to make sure that the field knows what they're trying to collect at the field level, and how to call that into the control room.
Okay. Well, let's pick this up here in terms of manual operations now. So there's the part for the internal communications plan, and then you definitely have to cover actual. So there's another detail here, that's manual operations. If you can describe, what the field personnel role is in each one of these, and just the controller role in general, and then how you're lining up your plan in terms of what's required in your plan for that.
Yeah. So, here you want to make sure your field personnel understand their role, right? So once this is activated, this is a part of your script, and making sure that when they're at the location, that they're looking at, if it's identified, pressures, flow rates, levels, status indicators, and, whatever gauges and equipment that they're looking at, that they're calling back into the control room.
Right.
Understanding that, manual operating valves, pumps, or compressors, that they're providing that to the controller. Because you got to remember, it's no longer on the screen, and your plan can state, maybe you don't have, some type of an indication out there for one of these things that you're calling out. Well, yeah, again, you've identified this is what you're going to be collecting, but you don't have this at your site or your location, or you can't even access it. So therefore, again, your plan is now looking a little shaky, right? Because you're saying you're doing it, but are you really doing that? And you have to make sure that that PIT that you're calling out, well, what location is this? What is the transmitter that you're looking at? And making sure that you're identifying that correctly to the controller. And you're making sure that overall, you're not making any type of changes out there.
Right.
You're reporting abnormal conditions or anything that you see abnormal, right?
Right.
Again, you, as far as the field personnel, and your role is to provide this information, know where it's at, know what you're calling back into the control room. So that's where it's really critical to make sure that you're reviewing your plan, and, field personnel know their role as part of it. And looking at the controller side of this, again, understanding, that information from, the lineups that they're looking at, information that's being called in from the field, and having them make changes as needed, based off the information that's being provided. Because, we're looking for that field personnel to report this information, not go and try to change anything, because we still are or the control room, the controller is still getting that information from multiple people, right? If you have a massive outage, there could be multiple people calling into the control room, giving them that information. He still now has a system understanding that, field personnel that's being sent to that location is not to, again, try to start manipulating things or changing things on his own. It's based off of what the controller's letting him know what to do.
Got it. So pretty much what you're saying is, on the plan alignment and the requirements, the internal communications plan, you really just want to support the tasks that are defined for both the field, and the operator, defining exactly what data, what to read, when to report it, and who confirms, the manual setups that are out there in the field, just to give you that safe operation and SCADA visibility that you don't have, but you're using this to do that, right?
Yeah,
on the manual plan.
And that's exactly what you want to make sure that you're staying within your plan.
Right.
Not be so vague. You want to make sure that that's really identified and drawn out to make sure that, again, to return the SCADA back to a normal state when it does come back up, if you actually have an event, but your tests should try to capture that.
Well, so before we go on to some common misconceptions, I'm going to touch on then the guidance that you've provided. So you've got some 4-step guidance that you've given us. The first one is you really want to map the roles and the paths. So identify, get those roles right. Get your channels defined, who you're actually calling, any sort of backup methods. That's step one. You've outlined step number 2 as being get your playbooks in order. Create your manual operation plan, right? Get your guidance right. Have some scenarios. Cover system-wide loss, cover regional StateCom loss, and then cover just display failure, period. And then give yourself some details, specify those required data fields, have the manual action outlined, and then create and then confirm any of the protocols steps that you're taking. Your step 3 that you've outlined is test annually. You really want to validate the adequacy of the test, take action on your plan, do your realistic and your tabletops, document your outcomes that came out of it, whether it's good or bad, and then integrate that into your CRM plan, right? Your actual address that as part of your MOC if you need to, get your plan connected with the right group, the right part, do your training. That has to be documented, of course, and then create define how you're going to have operator experience, right? When you're integrating that in your CRM. So you're going to refine your plan based on those real events or your tabletops, right? So
Yeah.
I think it kind of covers that.
And again, you want to make sure that from the testing perspective, people forget this. It's within a calendar year.
Yeah.
Not to exceed 15 months, right? So again, it's a calendar year. Did you do it within a calendar year? So that's from January, right, to December. Was it done in a calendar year? If you're good there, great. You can hit the 15 months, but did you hit the calendar year? That's what you want to make sure that you're doing as well.
Okay. So give us some misconceptions here, Daniel. Let's run through these pretty quick. We're running out of time. And, on the common misconceptions, let's go over a few, doubt clearing a little bit. One of the first things I'm sure that comes up is just having a phone tree. Is that enough for your plan?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's making sure that you're identifying, who you're talking to at the field level, who the controller is talking to at the field level, and understanding what information they're collecting. So again, scripts as far as identify within your plan, information being exchanged, and how to escalate if someone doesn't respond. Right. Yeah. So if you're on the list and you're making a call, it's not just about having that phone tree. It's about making sure who the next person is in line if someone doesn't answer.
Got it. One of the things you just mentioned earlier is, do you really have to test each year? Yeah.
So you do, and you have to do it. And again, this is what I was talking about, and this is the big thing is, if you're going to run a drill, and someone within the operation states, hey, you know what, we just had a real scenario. Okay, well, let's look at the real scenario, make sure we captured it correctly, and make sure the documentation is right. Again, it has to be done within that calendar year. You got to make sure that your documentation is accurate. And then, if you don't want to run a drill and you feel like, the actual event hits everything that you need, then that's fine as well. But yes, you definitely, you have to have a test every year, and it has to be within that calendar year, not to exceed 15 months.
Right.
I want to make sure to stress that everyone, needs to look at that within their plan as far as, having a manual drill.
One of the last ones here real quick is, is this only about total SCADA failures? And the answer is no, meaning, the requirement also covers partial outages, which is a loss of communication to like certain stations or regions, which require manual intervention, right? So let me ask you this question, knowing that. Does that mean that if I had a partial outage at a pipeline, let's say it's the Roadrunner pipeline, and it affected the pipeline segment, we had to go into an internal communication for that, and then we had a station downstream that shut down. We had to go for that was connected. Does that satisfy the annual requirement without doing a whole shutdown, without doing a whole, a full outage?
Well, you have to remember it could be for a partial communications. You have to remember the rules written from the standpoint of if you lost SCADA,
right,
and making sure that you're running the pipeline safely, right? So you want to make sure that hits what you're looking at from that standpoint. So looking at the scenario, making sure you knowing what the rule is and what's required. And again, it's all about, pipeline safety.
Yeah. I think what I'm getting at is I lost the SCADA system and I can't see that pipeline segment and that area, and it covered, 20 miles of pipe, and then it affected, some downstream tanks that we had, plus the producers upstream. We had lost communication to that. We couldn't see it in the SCADA system. That's a partial outage. We have a whole other system, but this Roadrunner system or whatever is shut down. Once it's, let's say you're out of your internal communications plan, you've done your steps, you've documented, you've followed your steps. Does that count for that year? I think is the question. Does that count, right? Versus, oh man, let's have a pure SCADA outage and do a big tabletop saying everything went down.
It probably counts as long as you cover the points that are in your plan that need to be tested, and I guess if you don't know, you've got a way to document this. You probably got a form in your CRM. And if you go to fill out that form and it's incomplete, you probably didn't get a full test.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at, because, there might be, an operator that's, a midstream operator that's regulated and has a segment area go out. It's not, they have to implement their internal communications plan. And then, do we have to really?
I mean, some of these operators have thousands and thousands of miles of pipe. Maybe they're in multiple control rooms, but some of them have central control rooms where they're controlling the whole lower 48, right? So
yeah.
It's probably a rare event to lose all SCADA in that situation.
Right.
Maybe you're on a redundant or backup or third backup, who knows? But it probably is more common to lose one, galaxy, so to speak, or one instance, or, that's what I'm thinking, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've seen, areas where you have a gathering system or some type of, residue side that's lost, communications. And again, you're looking at safe operations, right? So that's where you start looking at it from that perspective. And like you stated, you can fill out your form. Can you fill this out correctly, as far as, from that standpoint? Does it hit what you're trying to fill out here? So, I mean, there's several ways to kind of look at that. But my biggest thing is if you're operating that and you lost communications to it, go back to your plan, knowing that you have to maintain this pipeline. And even if you have this pipeline down, right, I've been in several, audits where, okay, say you've lost communications, but the pipeline is shut down. Okay, but who's still watching that, those pressures to report back abnormal operations? Who's looking at the equipment to say that your pressures are, you have no eyes on this. So when you're shut down, your controller still sees these, these systems,
right,
and they're able to see if the pressure drops. So again, trying to make sure that everyone understands from that standpoint, even if it's down, there still should be someone calling to report this information back from that standpoint.
Yep.
From a manual, like you have no SCADA visibility at all.
Yeah. Right. And so the interval that they call, I mean, could be 30 minutes on this pipeline. It could be 5 minutes on this pipeline. It could be an hour on this pipeline. It could be 2 hours on this pipeline. So I think every pipeline is different. Like some of them can go to hit their MAOP in 5 minutes, and some of them it's just not, physically, possible through physics to increase the pressure fast enough. So it may not be as quick. You may not have to check in as often. But one thing I would want to mention is we talked about the form. Just a side note. This summer, I was with the client during an audit, and they had 4 or 5 years worth of records they were going through, and in several instances, I'll point out one, but on the hours of service form they had, the form was so poor that it led to violations because the form didn't force them to fill in the correct information. And, maybe the client didn't understand exactly what the requirements were there. We kind of came in after the fact. But here's what we did for them. We made a form that's kind of bulletproof, meaning if you go through this and fill it out in the required areas or the asterisk areas that are required, if you don't have information there, it's probably not a good record, right? So This would have helped them out a lot before because the way they were calculating their hours of service and their deviations. You can make that happen on your form. And what I would suggest to anyone out there is make your form ask the right questions to cover, you in that instance or whatever that, whatever that section of the CRM is or requirement is for the form. Make sure, even put the code on there, right? Like ask the right questions, make check boxes mandatory. And if you can't check them, you're probably missing something. You might need to go back and take another look. So
And that's exactly right. So you want to make sure that you're pointing your form back to the protocol and what the protocols require, right? So, and that's ultimately what I'm speaking to, exactly what you stated, is looking at knowing what you're required to do, what's being stated, and as far as any type of audit that you're going to go to, right? So, your audit's going to ask for a record if it's requiring a record because you're filling out a form. What's required on your form based off of that record?
Yeah, and I would say it should be easy by now. Cookie cutter set of forms. Why doesn't PHMSA just kick one out? Well, that's not their style, right?
No, because
they don't do that anywhere. So
it's
every
also
operation
the
is
operator.
unique. But if anyone out there needs help, putting together the couple dozen forms you might need for a CRM, give Daniel a call for sure. We can point you in a path that kind of keeps you between a couple bollards at least when it comes to keeping your records right. So.
Yeah, it points you to the actual documentation or any FAQ or the federal rule. Period. Yeah. So let's go through those action items because Jeff, you threw out one that's free. There you go. There's one action item, but let's cover the three that are here. The first one is you really want to document your internal communications plan, right, Daniel? Like you really want to have, who talks to whom. We talked about that. Specify your channels that you're going to be using, your fallback path. Number two is define your manual operations playbooks. Get those in order. Even if some of them have scripts and checklists, you want to have those, understand what your update frequency is, what your local readings might be, any sort of lineup procedure. Confirm your protocols for your outage scenario. That is system-wide versus regional, right? Make your determination. And then finally, you give us one where it's test annually. Keep your records. Exercise the plan at least once on that calendar year. Couldn't stress that enough. Get your logs right. Have your scope and participants and results. And any lessons learned, right?
Yeah.
Last question, Daniel, for you is when you did this, what were some of the good things you saw some of your clients do, in the past?
A lot of them actually, when they would do their drill, they would, make sure beforehand that they would, again, confirm that hey, if I'm going to send someone out to this location, based off of so many, readings that I would need to collect, or that they understand their staffing at the field level.
Yeah.
They've identified critical sites and locations, and they understand that travel time because on the SCADA screen, right, everything looks so close together. There are little dots and things like that. But understanding that there is drive time from one location to the other.
Yeah.
And whether or not they're going to set someone there just to stay at that location and not have them move around based off of, that area that they're covering. There could be several people in play, right? So, a lot that I would interact with the clients is making sure that they've identified that drive time, that they identified the checklist as far as what, they're looking to collect from that location, and not make it so cookie cutter from the standpoint of, all right, let's call out what normal operation looks like here, and then identifying any type of different lineups, things like that. Make sure that we document that and place that within their operations so that way everyone's on the same page, and making sure that things are identified from the standpoint of, equipment being called into the control room. You don't want something on SCADA saying it's, suction pressure or discharge pressure, and it's identified at the, at the field level, it's PIT. And even at that, to go even further, you want to make sure within your operations and your plan, again, you're looking at gauges. So, it's not a digital number that you would see on the SCADA system. Identifying at the field level, whether or not, are you rounding up? Are you rounding down? What's the best way to call this as far as, how that information is being read and being provided to the, to the control room?
Yeah. So I think we got some good takeaways here. We've got some get your adequate plan, your documentation on that internal communications for enabling the safe manual operation of your pipeline system, and through the control room. You really want something that is vigorous and annually tested, right? And so we got some key takeaways, which are like a strong plan, define who, and this boils down to really just who, how, and what info. Next is have your annual drills. Make those drills pretty real, right? So I think that's good. Daniel, what can we expect going into the next episode?
Yeah, next episode we're going to be speaking about backup SCADA systems. If you have a SCADA system, right? So if you have a SCADA system, what's that look like as far as a backup and testing? Make sure we go over that and provide some information there regarding any type of audits that you would go into, and that way you can take it back to your operations folks or your SCADA groups and talk to them about these and make sure that you have that information lined up, ready to go, going in any type of audit and prep.
Oh, sounds good. So remember, don't forget to like and subscribe here and put in your scenarios, put in your questions. You can put in your question. We'll be happy to answer those too. Pass this on to your community, to the community. We want to hear from you. And again, thanks for joining us. I'm your co-host, Mike Flores, with the Energy Tech Podcast, OpSite Energy, and this CRM mini-series with our expert, Mr. Daniel Netto.
Thanks.
Glad to be here. This was good.
Yeah, absolutely.